legal aspects with an emphasis on smart contracts. If I can set it up, as we were talking in the hallway, I gave a prosaic example of how I can understand smart contracts or a way to explain them. Imagine that you have a teenager, or if you don't, imagine when you were a teenager, and it was time to take out the garbage, or it was time to mow the lawn, and you have to constantly hound your kid to do those things. Well, what if you had a smart contract that you set up that was then also married with Internet of Things, that was married with a geospatial device, and you could create that contract that once the garbage was removed from the garbage pail and then deposited in the alley, a sensor would track that. And when the lawnmower was taken out of the garage and moved enough around, it was tracked by geo that it moved around when the yard was actually mowed. That automagically, your teenager got paid for doing that. That's one way to think of the simplest of ways of what a smart contract might be. In any case, I'd like to, we've got an esteemed panel here of people who know quite a bit about more smart contracts than I do. I'd like to give them each a minute or so to introduce themselves, and then we'll get into some questions.
Hi, my name is... Hi, we'll try that again. My name is Kevin Wixted. I'm the CISO for DLA Piper. You might wonder why I'm CISO talking to you folks today, but as the Chief Information Security Officer, I partner up with our Chief Transformation Officer on a number of initiatives, including everything that we're doing around blockchain at the firm. So I'm the sullen, cloudy-faced person that talks about risk and things like that, and he's always talking about opportunity. But the bottom line is that's what our law firm does with our clients. We help them mitigate risk and we help identify opportunities, and so that's what we do with the blockchain today.
I'm Will Turner. I'm a partner at Barnes & Thornburg, and I have a background in corporate securities law, and so applied to the blockchain space. I've seen a number of strategies that have implicated, knowingly and unknowingly, various elements of the security statutes as well as the community statutes.
I'm Smolinski with Smolinski Rosario Law. I'm a patent attorney and I also serve as general counsel for medium-sized tech companies, including some companies in the blockchain space. And so I've really been interested in blockchain technology for about 5 years and started hosting events in Chicago about the technology about 2 years ago with George and FinTank. And I just basically think it's really interesting. I like talking about this stuff, and it's kind of exciting to see some of the initial ideas, sort of like the prosaic example you gave, Chuck, starting to come to fruition. And I think that's where this smart contract concept actually hitting the ground. That's some of the stuff that first got me interested in the space.
Okay, great. Well, let me throw out a proposition to you guys. And since you come from a legal background, legal side, then you guys can rip this apart. But let's say a proposal that smart contracts are neither smart nor contracts. Is it true, false, or somewhere in between?
I can jump in on this one to start. I think it's, first of all, statutorily required that quote must be used in every smart contract discussion. So thank you for taking care of it. And I think there's some truth to it, as with every joke, right? The smart part, right? Well, how smart is it? Most smart contracts are not in any way based on anything that you would call artificial intelligence even, and query whether artificial intelligence really fits the category of smart. Most smart contracts are super simple scripts. The vast majority of smart contracts just say, give me this token, I'll give you that token. So in the wild, smart contracts are about as simple as you get from a coding perspective. Secondly, on the contracts, well, in a very narrow sense, yes, but they don't contain the qualities that you would normally expect from a contract, right? They're not, for the most part, they're not human readable. And if you were to walk into a courtroom and try to quote-unquote enforce a smart contract, the first thing the judge would say is like, what is this and what does it mean, right? So there's no really robust legal ecosystem built up around interpreting them and around interpreting and around controlling what happens when they go wrong. So yeah, I mean, the phrase is a little troublesome. And I would also point members of the audience who are interested in this to a quote that Taryn made just this last week, where he said he wishes he had never associated the term smart contracts with Ethereum, because it basically got a bunch of lawyers involved.
Well, what's your experience with this? You've been very involved in this space.
I feel like I'm walking into a punch with the quote from Vitalik, but let me suggest that smart contracts would be smart if the impact of their use is superior to the effect of the traditional alternative. So one place where I've seen clients work on and improving on a traditional contract is around audit rights. So if you're negotiating a contract that contemplates a substantial number of payments based upon third-party actions such as civil goods, you have to contemplate recording a substantial amount of data, and then the parties of the contract have to rely on one another to behave honestly in order to assure that payments that have been agreed to. Traditionally, in a contract, one of the ways to discipline that honesty, since we're loath in our business to take people solely at their word, is to create contractual audit rights. So the right of the party receiving payments to go in and inspect the records of the payor. In my experience, that's one of the most difficult areas of the contract to get the yes on, because both parties have very strong concerns around privacy and economic rights. And if smart contracts can be used to create a audit trail that both parties have access to, I would submit that they may in fact be smarter than the traditional contract.
Okay, so it's smarter. That's a good way to put it. Kevin, do you have anything to add to DLA Piper?
Yeah, from my standpoint, the smart part of the smart contract is the conditional logic, right? If the condition has been met, then we proceed to the next part of the script, just like Zach was talking about. So, is that smart? No, but are there smart people that had to define that logic? And are there smart people that have reviewed the business consequences of that logic? Absolutely. So, I would argue that the smarts behind smart contracts are on the behalf of the creator.
To pivot a little bit, I think it's germane to this conversation as well, is from your experience, what are key issues that are acting as roadblocks or impediments to the blockchain smart contract adoption at the enterprise level?
Well, I can take the enterprise since I'm the IT nerd in the crowd. Enterprises, big organizations are risk averse if they want to stay in business. And the idea of a distributed system, as opposed to a system that would be normally within your own four walls of your data centers, will give a lot of people in certain seats in the boardroom pause, right? So there's a little bit of a leap of faith there as far as a distributed system as opposed to an enterprise hosted system. Other things that we see when we're talking to clients that folks are worried about are who owns it, quote unquote, the solution. That seems to be a conceptual issue for a lot of the folks that we talk to. So that's something we have to work through as an industry.
Do you guys find the same from more practicing attorney side of things?
Yeah, I would say from the practicing attorney standpoint, I still have yet to have someone come into my office and say, here's a smart contract, and read it and help me to evaluate it. And I think there are a couple of reasons for that. One is I think to a large degree, certainly enterprises are still sort of figuring out how this stuff all works together. And so are smaller entities. And so what happens is if you're spinning up blockchain-based business, you're probably generating a smart contract along the way. And if you know what you're doing, you're probably having that smart contract audited by a dedicated smart contract auditor who's probably a coder or a team of coders, right? And what is probably not happening in that transaction is that a lawyer is getting involved in looking at the audit report. It's super common for especially smaller blockchain companies to go a good long time without getting attorneys involved in the mix because attorneys are certainly perceived as being expensive and sometimes not worth it, and can you get a business together without it, right? So the legal impact of a faulty smart contract often will simply not be considered, or it might be thrown into some sort of a warning document that goes out to investors saying, hey, our smart contract's been audited, but it could go haywire, and here's what could happen. So then you get into the insurance world, right? So the question is, how are all of these entities combining together to ensure that A, the smart contract won't go haywire, and B, if it does, it won't cause a massive, massive problem. And it's communication and coordination, and I just think people aren't used to it. That's my take.
Yeah, from my perspective, the areas of the U.S. law that are having difficulty adjusting to this new world, that tension is more pronounced in areas other than contract law. So people seem to have a commercial willingness to utilize smart contracts or programs in order to allocate rights. I don't see the law being an impediment so much in this part of the blockchain industry.
Okay. One thing, lawyers have done very well by blockchain. There's been a lot of consultants, lawyers that really at the front of the line. They're doing a lot of work on this. But in being at the front of the line, you're there as it's almost like watching a new universe being developed. What do you see as recent developments of where things that are happening now, and what are the impacts of that as we go forward?
One of the things I think we're seeing is a maturation of the technical space generally. I think 2017. Obviously, anyone who was remotely interested in the financial world was interested in cryptocurrencies and Bitcoin in particular. And so it was very easy to have those conversations, and they just couldn't walk down the street practically without hearing someone talk about it. It's only been 10 months since the big run-up, but I believe, it's my take, is that sort of downturn has sort of shaken out much of the, I'll call it just curious money. And what you're seeing now is the survival of teams that actually are trying to build something. I think you're also seeing the survival of teams who will never build anything and who just made a lot of money. So we're going to have, I call it take the money and stay. So a big part of what we're seeing in the blockchain world is teams that ICO launches that brought in a ton of money and we're never going to see those projects. But what I am in it for is the opposite of those people. What I'm in it for is the people who took the money and are staying or are building something interesting, and I think that's the direction things are going to be going.
Well, what do you see legally what's developed and has been signposts for the future?
So one interesting difference for me is that last year I talked to a fair number of folks that philosophically believe the space should not be regulated. Particularly those who wanted to be issuers. In the U.S., it seems hard it seems impossible to make that argument now. More interesting for me is that there has been the emergence of a number of actors who've embraced regulation and identified themselves as wanting to be regulated, but operate in the crypto space. And the problem that many of those actors are facing now is that it's actually tough to get a regulator to license a business in the space, even if you are willing to and dedicate the resources that traditionally are required to obtain licenses.
Kevin, you come from a different perspective, but how do you see the dynamic playing out within the law firm from where you stand from more for the technology and infrastructure side?
Sure. So just to touch on one point that you made about regulation. I mean, again, as a risk manager, I definitely see regulation as a good thing for helping technology or an industry emerge, because it kind of gives you the four corners, right? In terms, now you might not like where those four corners are drawn. You might disagree with parts of the regulation, but if you're trying to manage risk and sell an opportunity to a particular investor or industry or whatever, or client, it helps if you actually have, you can define it and you can say, well, this is compliant with regulation or this is not compliant. There's a lot of advantages there. In terms of new developments that we've been seeing, I think the emergence of consortiums is a good thing for the industry. I think it helps give some credibility. I'd be interested to see what these gentlemen have to think about consortiums. But one of the things that we see on the law firm side is consortiums creating colleagues that have like interests, and that builds confidence amongst our clients.
So what would be an example of a consortium that you're referring to?
Well, there's a couple of them. Federa would be one of them. And again, I apologize, I don't know all the players, I just know the folks that we've talked to. But that's definitely one that you guys think about.
Do you guys have a perspective on that?
I think generally it's probably what I would consider to be part of almost a three-legged stool of regulation. The regulatory agencies themselves, industry consortia, which can be sort of a privately led group of individual players, and then the third leg being the individual companies themselves. So I think consortia can serve as the great intermediary between the full-on regulation and the individual businesses that sort of constitute the consortia. Essentially, they just become lobbyist organizations. So that's one thing. But in a more positive way, they can serve to normalize behaviors and expectations within space. And as a consortium member, you often have a certain amount of credibility that you might not have if you were acting solo.
Yeah, I think the last point is an important one. In the absence of concrete regulatory guidance, one of the things you can do as a commercial actor, one of the things that I can do as counsel to a commercial actor is point to industry best practices, and this is an amazing industry. So it's still in the process of developing best practices, but to the extent that bodies, consortia, or digital channel commerce continue to promote best practices, I think it's a positive for the entire industry.
All right. Well, we'll take one more question and then try and take some questions from the audience as well. There's been a great focus on financial services with blockchain, with cryptocurrencies. But interestingly, at the Futures Industry Expo was here this week, and Charles Lee, who was the head of the Hong Kong Futures Exchange, when he was asked about crypto, his second comment was that he thinks that the biggest, or blockchain more broadly, his second point was he thinks the biggest impact might be in Africa, that it could just be transformational for the continent. Well, in that kind of context, there's been a lot of focus on financial services, but when we've seen guacamole earlier in the day here, and what are areas you see, or what are particular areas of interest for you in the application of blockchain technology?
For me, I think it's very natural for this technology to be impacting financial services. And I think that there's certainly a lot of reasoning that says if your blockchain doesn't involve the transaction of value between actors, you probably don't need a blockchain. The thing is that value can take a lot of different forms. So value can take the form of personal identity. I think there's some really interesting work being done with identity and confirmation of credentials electronically, where we don't show each other easily faked IDs, and we have a more robust system of transacting that. Query whether you need a blockchain for that, right? If you have a very robust centralized database, that might work too. Where else are we seeing it? I mean, everybody saw the announcement of the IBM Walmart collaboration with the supply chain. So a lot of people are talking about supply chain and blockchain. There again, private blockchain, do you really need the technology? But as supply chains perhaps open up, maybe that's not a really comforting phrase for supply chain experts, but as things like provenance and proof of origin are more and more important to be shared across organizations, I think you can make a good argument that some sort of permissionless blockchain might come to that.
Will, do you have any thoughts?
One of my interests is folks that are using blockchain to measure non-capitalist items that they consider to be goods, and attempting to either tokenize them or otherwise use the blockchain in order to promote the use of those goods. So there are a number of companies, both startups and established companies, that have dedicated some resources to using the blockchain to address the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. It's much too early to see to know how successful that might be, but it's to me a very interesting development in the space.
One of the things that we've been working on at DLA is working with some government organizations and governments to use blockchain for land registry. Interestingly enough, there's 70% of the people in the world live on land that isn't registered to them or to anyone as an owner. And we're looking to and starting to work with some governments to try to use blockchain to provide that kind of proof of ownership. And in a solution that survives things like floods, that kind of thing.
Interesting. Well, we've got a couple minutes left, so I'd like to turn it out to the audience. Right here in the second row, we've got a guy over here.
Hi, everyone.
Hi. Hi, everyone. What do you think about the regulation in Malta, specifically in blockchain?
Are you asking about the distributed ledger regime that Malta has adopted?
Yeah.
So I don't personally have a client that's gone through the regime. I've had a couple of clients that have evaluated Malta together with other regimes, which I would call kind of the usual suspects: Switzerland, Cayman Islands, Gibraltar. But I haven't had anyone that selected Malta at this point.
What if we broaden the question? Are there dangers of regulatory arbitrage that people are going to find the best, least amount of regulation? That's where they're going to start to do their blockchain work.
From the perspective of a U.S. lawyer, no, because the U.S. government has successfully asserted for a long time that it has jurisdiction over acts that impact its citizens. So the argument that a number of fraudsters, to use an SEC term, have used for years, that they were outside the borders of the U.S. and therefore not subject to SEC or DOJ jurisdiction, is quite unsuccessful.
Not so fast. Do you have any thoughts on that today?
It's pretty much just what Will said. I think I don't really completely understand the motivation of companies that form in Malta and some of the other jurisdictions that Will mentioned with the intent of taking in U.S. money. You're going to be subject to U.S. jurisdiction, as Will mentioned, more likely than not. And a lot of these companies have just built this fiction that they're not taking U.S. money, and they have this sort of like wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Just don't tell us when you're from the United States, and you can join into our great opportunity. And it's just hogwash. You're probably saving some money in terms of, and this is just my opinion, but you're probably saving some money in terms of maybe some of the regulatory stuff up front. I understand, I'm not a tax lawyer, but you know there are reasons that big corporations rely on countries like Ireland for passing transactions through, and perhaps there's some benefits to be gained from that. I just don't know, I don't do that work.
So, just a quick question, Zach. You mentioned earlier that Vitalik and that kind of struck you that interesting concept here. You mentioned that Vitalik regrets actually calling it smart contracts, right? And that can unleash the whole legal industry into this blockchain space. But the reality is that when you look at the blockchain stuff, surely legal firms are not reviewing smart contract code. Like, because at the end of the day, the code in smart contracts really is it's code, right? It's programming. You're not doing that, are you? I mean, you're really focusing around the ecosystem around the various firms that are looking to leverage the blockchain and so forth. So I'm just curious as to understand from all the panelists here as well, your thoughts in terms of whether you see value add that legal law firms can provide in actually reviewing smart contracts specifically.
That's a good question, and I'll break it into two different points. First of all, I think that Vitalik's quote was a little more nuanced than I may have conveyed the first time, and that I think what he was really saying was that these things that we're calling smart contracts are, for the most part, super simple scripts, and just aren't very interesting from a legal perspective. And he thinks it got too many eyes on that phrase. Interestingly, I think also the fact that they used the term smart contract was one of the reasons that Ethereum got so big. Like if you didn't use the phrase smart contract, no one's going to get too excited about, oh, serial script technology. Like, who cares? So he's definitely playing the balancing act with that phrase. On the legal side, correct, I'm not a coder. If you gave me a smart contract and perhaps like a little script of exactly what it does, I could probably work my way through it. But what I would do is I would rely on the smart contract auditor for a record of what the smart contract does and a statement that it actually does what it says it's going to do. And then I would do what lawyers usually do, which is try to imagine what the worst case scenario is and try to make sure that from a contractual and insurance standpoint that my client is well guarded against the worst.
Yeah, maybe the future speak a little bit. The legal industry has been impacted by technology the same as most industries. So when I went to law school, you actually went to the library, and when you wanted to learn the law, you looked at old-fashioned books, and they taught you about how to do research, computerized research, but it was considered sort of faddish at the time. I had a colleague a few years ago who refused to look at a book when I asked her to because she felt like it was inherently unreliable, and what was available via the research services was more reliable. Now, we might argue her particular point, but I think the perception is an interesting one. It's quite conceivable that law firms might view their role in the future as including coding smart contracts. I haven't seen that yet. I have seen companies that incorporate a lawyer along with coders to provide services in the space. They don't call themselves lawyers in that capacity, but that is perhaps one reaction to this technology.
When you made that comment about Vitaly, I thought back to Michael Milken, who regretted ever calling them junk bonds. That was a little bit to him. He used to call them high yield bonds, but the names stick. And there they go. Well, we're out of time. I know there's a lot more questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to everyone. Hopefully we'll be around for a little bit to answer questions. And thank you everyone for your time. Thank you, Chuck, and thanks to the panel. Great job. These guys have a lot of knowledge. If you need an attorney in the space, these are the guys to see. So with that,